If the thesis is that the UN helps to build a one-world government, then the Rockefeller family and the UN would have to be connected. That means the total and ultimate control of all mankind is wrapped up in nice words. And the whole thing is not a fantasy or a discussion. These are goals decided by the UN. Back in June 2019, the World Economic Forum and the UN signed a strategic partnership agreement to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Various organizations are openly striving for world power, for example through the UN. Germany, for example, is also actively working on the complete abolition of democracy. It now depends on whether the nations wake up and the people take their destiny and the fate of their country into their own hands again. From September 19th through Saturday, September 23rd and Tuesday, September 26th, 2023, the United Nations General Assembly will meet in New York. Heads of state and government will meet at the UN headquarters, a total of 193 countries, represented in the UN out of a total of 195 countries. Regarding the current General Assembly, the UN writes, among other things, that they want to reignite a feeling of hope, optimism and enthusiasm for the 2030 Agenda. But what does the 2030 Agenda include, and what goals are pursued here? Before we address these questions, first a few words about the UN and its history.
UN Foundation and Prehistory.
The predecessor of the United Nations, or UN, was the League of Nations, which was founded in 1920 after the First World War. Its official goal was to promote international cooperation and to achieve peace as well as security. On April 18, 1946, the League of Nations dissolved at its 21st Assembly. It was replaced by the founding of the United Nations. All of its assets were transferred to the new organization. The United Nations officially describes its founding as follows.
When World War II ended in 1945, nations lay in ruins and the world wanted peace. Representatives from 50 countries gathered at the United Nations Conference on an international organization in San Francisco, California, from April 25th to June 26, 1945. For the next 2 months, they worked to draft and then sign the UN Charter, creating a new international organization, the United Nations, which, it was hoped, would prevent another world war like the one we had just experienced.
Securing world peace is still one of the most important tasks of the UN, according to its charter. Is this true, or is the UN being used to build a one-world government under its guise? A quote attributed to David Rockefeller raises questions in this regard. Speaking before the United Nations Economic Committee in 1994, he said, "We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order." So if the thesis is that the UN is helping to build a one-world government, the Rockefeller family and the UN must be linked.
The UN and the Rockefeller family.
It is interesting to know that the Rockefeller Foundation made a decisive contribution to the organization of the world after World War II. It was the studies by the Council on Foreign Relations that were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and ultimately led to the creation of the World Bank, NATO, and the UN, among others. John D. Rockefeller had already donated a library to the predecessor of the UN, the League of Nations. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon mentioned this in a speech in 2012.
I am honored to be here on this 85th anniversary of the historic donation of John D. Rockefeller Jr. to the League of Nations Library. It is fitting that we are naming this room after him. I thank the family for donating the portrait of John D. Rockefeller that was displayed at the Rockefeller Foundations for 65 years. The Rockefeller family has lived up to this conviction, providing immense support for the League of Nations and the United Nations over the years.
John D. Rockefeller also donated the land, 7 hectares, on the east bank of Manhattan, where the cornerstone for the UN headquarters in New York was laid on October 24, 1949. The Rockefeller Foundation, together with the Rockefeller family, had and still has a considerable influence on the creation and development of the UN. This is already shown by the connections to the last 3 UN Secretaries General. Kofi Annan was UN Secretary General from 1997 to 2006. He is the recipient of the 2009 David Rockefeller Bridging Leadership Award. He was present at the presentation of David Rockefeller's memoirs, and the statement from the Rockefeller Foundation after his death was, "Kofi Annan was one of our longest and strongest partners." Antonio Guterres and Ban Ki-moon also appear to have a good connection to the Rockefeller family. Ban Ki-moon was UN Secretary General from 2007 to 2016 and is seen here meeting with David Rockefeller. Ban Ki-moon gave an acceptance speech in 2012, as mentioned earlier, mentioning that the Rockefeller family has been immensely supportive of the United Nations over the years. Antonio Guterres has been UN Secretary General since 2017. In the photos shown, he meets with Ariana Rockefeller and David Rockefeller Jr.
Agenda 2030.
Now back to the Agenda 2030. What is behind it, or rather what goals is the UN pursuing with it? KLA TV has already commented on Agenda 2030 in the program Fraudulent Labeling Agenda 2030, the way the UN is dragging the world into the abyss. How did the 2030 Agenda come about? It originally began with Agenda 21, a UN action program adopted in 1992 that contains concrete recommendations for action in development and environmental policy for the 21st century. With Agenda 2030, adopted by the UN in 2015, the goals of Agenda 21 were further developed and now apply equally to all countries. The current meeting now serves to review the implementation of the 2030 Agenda with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Has the implementation of Agenda 2030 so far shown at all that the UN wants to promote the world community? Or is the implementation gradually leading the world into the abyss, or in other words, into a one-world government? Investigative journalist Thomas Röper comments on the 2030 Agenda in more details in his book Inside Corona. He writes,
The 2030 Agenda was adopted by the states of the UN, and the fact that there's a separate catalogue of measures in Germany for this already shows a central problem. Each state interprets the goals in its own way.
The following are key points of the 2030 Agenda that should be looked at in more detail. The 16th key point reads, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Sub-item 16.9 states, by 2030, provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. This point, in example, the creation of a uniform legal or even digital identity for all the people of this world, is already in full swing with ID 2020. ID 2020 plans a transnational digital identity to complement state systems. All information about the individual should come together here. Education and vaccination certificates, financial status, accounts on Facebook, data produced by the smartphone.
That means that the total and ultimate control of the whole mankind is packed in nice words. And the whole thing is not a fantasy or discussion. These are goals decided by the UN, which are being worked on, and billions are being spent on the implementation.
ID 2020 also shows the connection to the Rockefeller family. The Rockefeller Foundation is one of the central organizations behind ID 2020.
Funding of the 2030 Agenda.
According to its own information, the UN needs $5 to $7 trillion a year to finance the 2030 Agenda. That is 5,000 to 7,000 billion. By comparison, Germany's annual gross national product is about 4,000 billion. By the way, the UN is financed by the contributions from the member states. According to the UN, in order to provide these huge sums, it needs, among other things, to promote public-private partnerships, another goal of the 2030 Agenda.
Public-private partnerships.
What does this mean when public-private partnerships are to be promoted? Thomas Röper goes into detail about this in his book and writes on page 46,
"It is about giving corporations more influence over the UN. Or, to put it in geopolitical terms, it is about increasing the power of corporations at the expense of nation-states. The corporations want to make the rules and no longer have to obey the laws of the nation-states. In the long run, they want to disempower nation-states, and especially their parliaments, which can pass disruptive laws. To disguise this erosion of democracy, good-sounding terms like public-private partnership are invented. It reassures the public."
In addition to large corporations, the public-private partnership also aims at increasing the influence of oligarchs. Thomas Röper understands oligarchs as people and organizations that exercise power over a region through their wealth, such as the Rockefeller Foundation and the World Economic Forum. Back in June 2019, the World Economic Forum and the UN signed a strategic partnership agreement to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Thus, various organizations are openly seeking world power through, for example, the UN. This is by no means an exaggeration, according to Röper. Germany, for example, is also actively working on the complete abolition of democracy, as stated in a document from the Federal Ministry of the Interior called the Smart City Charter. This was published in May 2017 and is available to KLA TV. Under the heading Vision of a Hyper-Networked Planet, it is written as point 6,
Post-voting society. Because we know exactly what people do and want, there is less need for elections, majority rule or voting. Behavioral data can replace democracy at the society's feedback system.
In the future, people should be digitally recorded and controlled so thoroughly that you can deduct from the data what the majority wants. A reason to no longer have to hold elections or make decisions without elections. Furthermore, the smart city concepts write about the post-ownership society.
Thanks to the information about available shared goods and resources, it makes less sense to own something. Perhaps private property will indeed become a luxury. Data could complement or replace money as a currency.
How on earth can such ideas be published openly? The abolition of democracy or private property would be against the law and should be punished. In fact, according to Thomas Röper, it happens anyway. They have been working on it openly for years. In summary, it can be seen that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are really about a slow but steady increase in the power and influence of the UN, because the states are being disempowered step by step. Democracy and ultimately the nation-states are gradually being abolished. Given the beginnings of the UN and the obvious influence of the Rockefeller Foundation, the question arises, was the creation of a one-world government one of its hidden goals from the very beginning? It now depends on whether the nations wake up and people take their destiny and the fate of their country into their own hands again. The peoples need to know the connections and plans behind the UN and its desired Agenda 2030. So spread this broadcast as widely as you can.